get a count for that. And we have new books. We're starting a new quarter this morning. Barry has those. If you didn't get one last week, raise your hand and he will get you a new book. We're studying Romans this quarter. Oh, you got to tear them open. All right. Josh, do you care to lead us in prayer as we get started?
Our most gracious and loving Heavenly Father, we're so thankful unto you for this beautiful Lord's Day that you blessed us with. We're thankful for this opportunity that we've had to gather here together as brothers and sisters in Christ to study your word, Lord. And we're thankful for this period of Bible study that we're so blessed to be a part of. And we pray that for Chris and for all the teachers downstairs that they've got a ready remembrance of the things that they've prepared. And we pray, dear Father, that us as listeners can focus intently upon your word and gain from it to apply it to our daily Christian lives and hopefully become better Christians in thy sight. We pray that everything that's said and done here this morning is according to thy will. As we depart, we pray that you give us a safe journey home. This we pray in your Son Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Josh. As I said, we're studying Romans this quarter. As Barry finishes, again, if you need a book, keep your hand up and he'll get you one. Thought I'd begin by throwing out a few details about the book of Romans, since it is the first lesson in this quarter. The author, as most of us know, is Paul. He identifies himself in the first verse by name. Paul, he identifies himself by his what he would have considered to be his identity, bondservant. That word bondservant is different than other types of a servant. How so? What's the difference between a servant and a bondservant? Well, a bondservant was sort of a willing servant. They were not necessarily forced to be a servant as maybe some other servants of that time. Paul considered himself a bondservant. He was willing to be a bondservant in the cause of Christ. He identifies himself by that. He identifies himself by his vocation. He was an apostle. It was important for him to say that, for him to tell these people he was an apostle, because that indicated the authority that he had and the words that he would say to these folks in Rome had authority, the authority of apostle behind them. And he also identifies himself in the first verse by his purpose. He was separated to the gospel of God. This book was written, according to our lesson, probably Paul wrote it in the time period that would have occurred in Acts chapter 20. He was in Corinth at that time. He wrote it somewhere probably between AD 55 and 58. And one of the interesting things about Romans, compared to some of the other writings that Paul had, he had not actually visited the church at Rome when he wrote this book. Most of the other books that Paul wrote, he wrote either to individuals that he was familiar with and had relationships with, or he wrote to churches that he had a relationship with, churches that he had helped to establish. But Rome was not that way. He had never actually been to visit the church at Rome, and he may have known a few of the people, and he makes a reference later on in the book to some individuals in that church, but he was not the man responsible for establishing the church at Rome. So that's a little unique part of the book. We really don't know how the church at Rome was established. We don't know, because Paul didn't establish it, didn't talk about the establishment of the church here. We really don't know. There's speculation that it might have been established from people who were present on the day of Pentecost. In Acts chapter 2 and verse 10, they are talking about the different people, the different groups of people who were present on the day of Pentecost, and it makes reference to some visitors from Rome. So there were people from Rome who were present on the day of Pentecost, And it's possible that they heard the message on that day that was presented by the apostles and then went back to their home and spread that message to others and established the church there at Rome. That's one theory, but again, we don't know that. This letter is also different because unlike some of his other epistles, there's not a specific, easy to define purpose for what he wrote. It's much more general. For example, 1 Corinthians, it's pretty easy to see the purpose of 1 Corinthians. It was to identify and stop divisions and false doctrines that were in the church. There were some things going on, specifically divisions going on, some immorality in the church at Corinth, and that was a specific purpose that Paul had in writing to those people. The book of Galatians was written because there were some false doctrines in that area, and so Paul wrote specifically to address some of those false doctrines. 2 Timothy, written specifically to an individual, basically Paul's farewell. He knew that his time on earth was drawing to a close, and he specifically wrote that book to give Timothy some final words and some final instructions before his passing. Romans is much more general. There's not that necessarily easy to identify purpose. It's much more general, much more doctrine, but there are some purposes that can be found, and I'll mention three of those. First of all, one of his purposes might have been to prepare them for his planned visit. We mentioned that he had not been to Rome, but he really wanted to go. In verse 13 of our text, now I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that I often planned to come to you, but was hindered until now, that I might have some fruit among you also, just as among the other Gentiles. So Paul really wants to go and visit these people, and so one of his purposes was to prepare them for his upcoming visit that he hoped would happen. Did he ever make it to Rome? Yes. In chains. Yeah, he sure did. He made it to Rome, but not the way he probably planned, not the way he probably expected. He came as a prisoner. But that was one of the purposes that he had. Maybe another purpose, a second purpose, was to establish them. And we're going to read about that in our text in verse 11. Paul wanted them to be established. He wanted to continue to give them further instruction. It was really important to have a strong church in Rome. Why would having a strong church in Rome be important to Paul? He was a Roman citizen, absolutely.
That was the hub of the world.
It was the hub of the world. A strong church in Rome is kind of like a strong church in the United States, I guess, or a large city in the United States. Everything's going on, and there was the saying in that time, all roads lead to Rome. So if he could establish a strong church in Rome, that church would hopefully spread to other parts of the world. Paul in this book takes us from, he gives us the good news and the bad news, right? He takes us from all has sinned and fall short of the glory of God, to, which is bad news. We're all sinners. We all fall short of what God is and what He wants us to be. But He takes us from that to God demonstrates His love for us, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us, which is the good news. A lot of doctrine in this book, a lot of talk about God, God's relationship to man, man's relationship to God. Several of our lessons, if you notice in the introduction of the book, several of our lessons are going to deal with God and His characteristics as He deals with man, and some of the things as men deal with God. And the third purpose that I think that we find that maybe he had in mind when he wrote this book was to ease some tensions between the Jews and the Gentiles, the Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. This book was written to Christians, but in the church at Rome there were both. There were Jews and Gentiles. Different people, different nationalities, different backgrounds, different ways of thinking. Why does that matter to us? Why does it matter to us today? Well, are there different people in the church today? Our church is not necessarily, the Lord's church is not segregated based on ethnicity or nationality or wealth or any other number of things that we can use to identify people and separate people. The gospel is for all. But tensions can still arise between people, because when you have any organization that involves people, there are going to be tensions, there are going to be conflicts at times that have to be worked through. And Paul in this letter gives some instructions on working through those. So that's some of the purposes and a little bit of the historical background on the book. Let's go ahead and read our lesson text. And I'll tell you, as I started and read this text 2 or 3 times, I started to notice certain words that popped out to me. And I began to identify in each verse, there were words that jumped out to me. And so I'm going to steal something that Eric did in a lesson some time ago, and others have done it too. I would encourage you to underline specific words, maybe a word or two in each verse as we read this that jump out to you. And I'm going to tell you the words that I underlined, and maybe yours will be different. And if they are, I hope you'll share that with the class, because if you do, I think it'll make the class much more beneficial to everyone. But let's read the text together. Romans chapter 1, the first 13 verses. Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated to the gospel of God, which he promised before through the prophets in his holy scriptures, concerning his Son, Jesus Christ our Lord, who was born of the seed of David according to the flesh, and declared to be the Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness, by the resurrection from the dead. Through him we have received grace and apostleship for obedience to the faith among all nations for his name, among whom you also are the called of Jesus Christ. To all who are in Rome, beloved of God, called to be saints, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of his Son, that without ceasing I make mention of you always in my prayers, making request if by some means now I at last may find a way in the will of God to come to you. For I long to see you, that I may impart to you some spiritual gifts, so that you may be established. That is, that I may be encouraged together with you by the mutual faith, both of you and me. Now I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that I often planned to come to you, but was hindered until now, that I might have some fruit among you, just as among the other Gentiles. So Paul, again, as we mentioned, begins in verse 1 with an introduction and also a reminder of his authority. What word did you underline in verse 1? Anybody want to mention that? Nobody underlined anything.
Christ keeps coming up.
Jesus comes up a lot. Yes. Yes. The one that jumped out to me was the word separated. Separated, which indicates his purpose, that he was separated to the gospel. In Acts chapter 26, beginning in verse 16, Jesus is talking to, at that time, Saul. Paul in that chapter is retelling the story of his conversion, and the words of Jesus are repeated. But rise and stand on your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to make you a minister and a witness both of the things which you have seen and of the things which I will yet reveal to you. I will deliver you from the Jewish people as well as from the Gentiles, to whom I now send you, to open their eyes in order to turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who are sanctified by faith in me. So Paul was Saul, and Saul was not a good person. Saul was persecuted Christians and all that, we know. But then he was separated to a different purpose. And Jesus told him specifically what that purpose was. And he spent the rest of his life trying to live according to that purpose. And as I read that, I thought about that word separated. And of course, we're to be separated for our own purpose. And our purpose is not that different from what Paul's purpose was. That's to serve God and to spread the message of the gospel to other people. Verse 2, I underlined the word promised. Paul's message was promised before, which he promised before through his prophets and the Holy Scriptures. The promise was given way back when to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that they were going to be many nations would come from their descendants. And throughout the Old Testament, you have all kinds of prophecy where promises were made. And every one of those promises that were made were kept. And so that's a reminder to us that God makes promises. He still has promises to us that He's going to keep. And we can take trust and take consolation in those promises. You know, as individuals, we make promises sometimes that we maybe fully intend to keep. And for whatever reason, something happens and we can't keep them. And that's disappointing to us if we have any character about us when we can't keep our promises. But it's disappointing to the person that was relying on us, that we'd made a promise to. That's not going to happen with God. There's not going to be anything that keeps Him from fulfilling His promises. So that word promise jumped out to me. And again, if you have something else, if another word caught your attention, I hope you'll feel comfortable mentioning that. Verses 3 and 4, I want to combine those because there's really a contrast, and the author of our lesson does a really good job talking about the contrast in verses 3 and 4. The words that jumped out to me in verse 3 was flesh, and verse 4 was spirit, because Jesus was both. And again, I'm going to read a little bit in our lesson on page 5. This Robertson Whiteside noted, the contrast in verses 3 and 4 is between the human nature and the divine nature of Jesus. As to His human nature, He was the son of David. As to His divine nature, He was the Son of God. By His genealogy, He was proved to be the seed of David, but the final proof that He was the Son of God was His resurrection from the dead. Again, this is a book about God. It's a book about Jesus, and that jumped out to me, that He was both spirit and flesh, born of the seed of David according to the flesh, but declared to be the Son of God with power according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection from the dead. Any comments? Y'all are being quiet. Well, verse 5, through Him we have received grace and apostleship for obedience to the faith among all nations for His name. I underlined in my lesson book the word all, A-L-L, all nations. The gospel is for all, not aimed at a particular ethnic group, nation, or people. It is a universal message for all who obey. That would have been, for some in this time period, a pretty controversial statement, because so many of Paul's writings seem to deal with conflict between Jews and Gentiles, between different groups of people with different backgrounds and thought processes and that. But there's a constant reminder that Paul has to give that we're all one in Christ despite our differences. And again, I think that's important, as I mentioned earlier, because the church today is still made up of people that in some cases would not have any dealings with each other necessarily outside the church. So many folks might not ever see the same people that they see at church, just in their regular dealings, or might not run necessarily in the same social circles outside the church, but the church brings us together. And I think that's a wonderful thing, and the potential diversity that we have in the church really should be a strong point, but it can also be a potential point of conflict and tensions that have to be worked through. Verse 6. Let's see, where is among whom you also are the called of Jesus Christ. Verse 7, to all who are in Rome, beloved of God, called to be saints. That word called comes in a couple of times, as well as the word saints. Called to be saints. Paul used the term saint. What does the term saint mean? Anybody know? Well, what I read, I couldn't have told you what it meant. It's used to identify Christians, but the actual meaning was Holy One. So as the called, as saints, which we are all, we probably don't think of ourselves as saints. We haven't been given sainthood necessarily like some in the Catholic Church have been given, but as Christians, we are supposed to be holy, and we are identified as saints. There's a parallel that Paul was called to be an apostle in verse 1. That was what he said when he identified himself. He was called to be an apostle. And we read about that in Acts when Jesus called him, gave him specific instructions that he was going to be an apostle. But the Romans were called to be saints. So, again, there's a call. And what are we called to be? Christians. We're called to be saints too, just like Paul was.
Was the original meaning of the word church called? I'm trying to think.
The called out. I've heard that. I think I've heard that, Barry. Yeah, yeah. So both were called. Paul was called to be an apostle. The Romans were called, and they both obeyed that calling. If you read Acts, there's the retelling of the conversion where Saul, who was called, accepted that call. Because it's one thing to be called, but you have to accept the call. Right? You're called to do something, you have to accept that. Paul did, and so did these Romans. They accepted their call and obeyed the message they were taught. Romans 6 deals with that they obeyed what they were called to do. Moving on to verse 8, Paul says, first, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. And there's multiple words in there that we could underline and focus on. I focus on that word thank, that he was thankful for the faith that was spoken of throughout the whole world. Man, that's an impressive statement, that their faith was spoken of not just in the area that they were, but in other places of the world, that people recognized the church in Rome and the faith that they had. But I focusing on that word thank, gratitude. We could talk a lot about gratitude. Gratitude makes people more attractive. I mean, maybe not physically, but you'd rather be around someone who has gratitude, someone who's thankful. And we've all been around people who don't have that, who are just ungrateful, and they're always sour, and they just don't ever show any kind of gratitude for anything. And then you contrast to that, there are people who are just exceptionally grateful. I mean, you ask them how they're doing, and they just will go on and on about how blessed they are and how God has blessed them, and use that opportunity to show gratitude to God. We've got a 4-H member and I don't even do 4-H in our office, but if I told somebody the other day, if you open the door for her, she'll send you a thank you note, because she's really good about sending thank you notes. If somebody does something for her, she shows gratitude. And boy, that really stands out, because how many of you have got a handwritten thank you note lately? I mean, we don't send those too often, don't receive them too often. So when somebody shows gratitude, sometimes it really stands out, because it doesn't happen as often. So I think, first of all, showing gratitude, but look what he showed gratitude for. I mean, it's easy to show gratitude, I think, for good things that happen to us. If we have good health, it should be easy to be thankful for that. If we've been blessed financially, it should be easy to be thankful for that. But what Paul was thankful for was interesting to me. I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. I mean, he didn't even know these people. He wasn't responsible for establishing the church in Rome, and yet he was thankful that they were doing well. He was thankful that they had faith that was spoken of throughout the whole world. That just really stands out to me, that he had that gratitude for a group of people that really he didn't know personally, but he took a great interest in them. And kind of continuing on that note in the next couple of verses 9 and 10, he says, "For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of his Son, that without ceasing I make mention of you always in my prayers, making request if by some means now at last I may find a way in the will of God to come to you." So in verse 8 I underlined in verse 9 rather, I underlined prayer, and in verse 10 request. So those kind of fit together. He's making prayer, he's making request. But what Paul prayed for, kind of like what he was thankful for, really stands out. Because again, kind of like being thankful, it's easy to pray for myself. It's easy for me to pray, well, Lord, please bless me with good health. Please bless me with a good job. Please bless me with all these things. And even my immediate family, it's easy for me to pray for them. God, please bless my immediate family, my close friends with these good things. But he's asking requests for people he didn't know. And I keep coming back to that because it just stands out to me that he is taking such an interest in fellow Christians that he had never met and did not necessarily have a hand in establishing the church there. Why was he so interested? Well, I think it's pretty obvious that he just loved his brothers and sisters, even those he hadn't met. I do think that he, being a Roman citizen, took a special interest, as Josh mentioned earlier, maybe in the church there at Rome, and the importance of it. If he could get the church established there, it would certainly spread. Eric?
It's interesting to look at this group of people, say if they were converted at Pentecost, spent some time in Jerusalem studying, and then they took what they learned there and went back to an area that had no Christians. And they were able to strengthen that group, convert, and build a church that Paul and the rest of the world knew about. And these guys didn't even have the spiritual gifts that Paul had not even gave them. So they were able to accomplish all that in an area where it should have been very difficult to do.
Great point. Great point. And how easy would it have been for them to make excuses to why they couldn't do that? And man, aren't we guilty of that? Making excuses. Well, people won't listen. Here's all the reasons why this won't work. Here's all the reasons why I can't do this. And like Eric said, these people went to a place that didn't have anything and established a church that everybody knew about and was a blessing to a lot of people. So it really is incredible what people can do just by being exposed to the message of the gospel. And if it is the case that it was on the day of Pentecost that those people first heard about and the message, and that those are the people that came and established this church, what a thought-provoking thing to think that just from one message such a huge thing happened. And I think you could expand that to talking about why it's important to invite people to church and just to say something about God or about Jesus, because you never know the impact that can have. Other comments? Appreciate that.
This group of people who went back to Rome, they had to be Jews or proselytes that were in Jerusalem for Passover. But they were used to being with Gentiles because they were living in Rome. So, they had a special quality, I would think, already, because they probably didn't fight over circumcision.
Yeah.
They didn't fight over all of the things that the Jews who were with Jews who were in Jewish areas were doing. And so it probably gave them a special insight into the what truly being a Christian is about, separating yourself from that ethnicity and all that stuff that creeps into other areas.
Sure, good point. Very good. Well, as we close, let me close by reading the conclusion here in the lesson book, because I think it's really good and gives some thought-provoking questions that each of us probably need to spend some time thinking about. And if we do so, I think it'll really help us and help the church. There on page 8, he says, Paul's obvious desire to help strengthen the church at Rome stands as a wonderful example for us to imitate. Rather than seeing what the church can do for us, we should consider what we can do for the church. What can you do to make the church where you attend stronger or more faithful? What can you do to share the message of Jesus with others? And what can you do to encourage your fellow Christians? And you and I need to probably look at those questions and really spend some time in thinking about what we can do to strengthen the church here and spread the gospel to others. I do appreciate you all sticking around for the class this morning and the good comments, and really, really much appreciated. So have a great day.